At the beginning and end of every question is a story. Stories give us purpose and meaning, something to hold on to in the chaos. In this way, stories are very much like rituals. But we must be careful with what we assume to be true. No matter how safe they may feel, how true they sound, every story holds a grain of deception. History isn't entirely real. Fiction not wholly fictitious. This is because words are a part of us, simultaneously illusory and yet as tangible as flesh. Stories help us reconcile our past and brave the future. Some speak of virtue and angels, and others, the demons we spend our lives quarreling with. But much like us, most aren't so simple. In fact, it's often the monsters we learn from, and the heroes who construct unrealistic expectations. Hiding in words are the devils of our better nature, the dark trappings of monsters always watching over us. Like blood, stories are transient, constantly changing and a light in our veins. Alive in the shadows of tales conjured from twilight hearts are villains. Should we catch them at the right time, they might just smile when we entreat their presence and show us their perspective. My name is Harlequin Grimm, and these are the stories of monsters whose voices are lost in history. And this is Mania. Marie Elizabeth Dura Fink was born to lesser nobles on October 30th of 1592 in Lorraine, France. A significant, strange date, without a doubt, one that would do well to foreshadow the rest of her life. As a young woman, she was forced into wedlock by her parents to marry a nobleman, François Dubois, a decision that she fought against every step of the way. With no desire to be married to him, she fled to a monastery for refuge. By 1618, she was recovered from the monastery and married to Dubois. Despite all of her parents' attempts, Elizabeth grew to be a fiercely independent individual. Not only was she dragged kicking and screaming to the marital altar, she was resistant to the life that came with it. One evening that same year, she was taken to a social event with her husband. Marie was surrounded by the very same people which caused her life to tumble so horrendously out of control. Noblemen and women everywhere with their polite snickeries and finery, the pleasantries, the tinkling of expensive china, and backhanded insults. All Marie ever wanted was some peace and quiet to herself. Hard to believe it, but the life of a nun was what was attractive to her. Some girls would peer out from the darkness of their impoverished lives, looking on at the Piddock mansion with envy. But for Marie, a night like this was just another nail in the coffin of her quiet dreams. The only interesting thing that ever happened at events like this were sudden outbursts or mishaps. Marie enjoyed watching the panic in people's faces as they scrambled to maintain the stiff perfection of their facades. The gala was for Jacques Collot, both a craftsman and an artist. His prolific hand, which made over 1,000 etchings by this time, chronicled the life of his period. His subjects included soldiers, clowns, drunks, gypsies, and even court life, of which I will be sure to provide some example pieces on my website should you be interested in seeing them. Just as you might view them now, Marie also found her eyes wandering over his craftsmanship. Dozens of his pieces were hanging from the ceiling around a famous etching from one of his collections entitled The Miseries and Misfortunes of War. I won't even attempt to pronounce the French version of that. One piece in particular caught her eye. She wandered close to it. Behind her, her husband tumbled down the rabbit hole of political discourse and pleasantries. The rest of the pieces from the collection suddenly hit Marie with an equal intensity. More gruesome, more imagery. With enough staring, the scratched lines became firm pieces of flesh, limbs, heads, the expression of despair on a still, swaying face. That was when something inside her quietly snapped. It was not the psychotic breaking of screams and tantrums you might imagine. It was an almost gentle, if not immediate stripping of her cares for the false life she was forced to live. Something about the artist's depictions tore down her barriers, stripped her soul clean. She felt exposed, but honest, even bold. It was somehow liberating. She left the crowds and ventured outside. The early summer granted the air a forgiving warmth in the gardens of the mansion, but Marie wasn't interested in the roses. She wandered far, past the grounds that the servants were instructed to keep patrolled. She wandered to the edges of the mansion grounds, long past any lights or lanterns guiding the well-lit paths. Here, the beginnings of a forest drew nearer, and like all forests do, the edge was a doorway, boasting chaos, an entrance to a world where life and death sang a hymn uninterrupted by humans. Marie heard approaching footsteps and turned to see somebody else dressed for the event approaching her. He followed into the path of trampled grass that she left. She greeted him, surprised to find she was not at all feeling uneasy by his presence, not unnerved by the fact that she was alone with him. This surprise deepened into a self-fascination when she found she could observe nothing of his face, shrouded by the wide brim of a black hat several centuries out of fashion. "You appear to be out of place, Miss Rainfaing," he observed. She stopped herself from asking how he knew her name. There was nothing normal about this circumstance. Marie half expected that, should she reach her hand out to touch the stranger, her hand would pass straight through. She didn't test this hypothesis, largely because she was afraid it was true. "This is exactly where I long to be," was all she said. Marie could observe little change in the unlit details of his expression, but he gave a slow nod and was quiet for some time, as if this reply implied a deeper affirmation, perhaps even agreement of great significance. "You wonder what it would be like, don't you?" he asked her. Marie said nothing. "What it would be like to escape all of this." He gestured to the glowing outline of the mansion behind him. When he turned his head back to her, the brim of his hat lifted out of the shadows from the moonlight to reveal a surprisingly youthful face, one that did not belong to the rich, syrupy voice which came from it. "I do," Marie whispered. Again, she resisted the urge to ask who he was, or indeed how he knew who she was, as if this would taint an otherwise pure ritual. "Drink this," the stranger said. The stranger unveiled a small tincture from his coat. The displacement of the cloth revealed that he was slim, well built, and yet Marie was struck by the instinct that this was somehow an artifice, that what was beneath the innermost outlines of his clothing was nothing. A hollowness. Marie took the tincture. "Unbridled, alone, at peace, free," the stranger coaxed. For the first time he smiled fully. His right incisor was nearly double the size of his other teeth, protruding in such a way that it hooked over his bottom lip, lending a rather boyish peculiarity. Though she lingered on the sight, the stranger continued to smile, perhaps unnervingly so. His dark eyes smoldered, the pupils seeming to grow with anticipation as Marie wet her lips. She uncorked the slender vial, slender like the fingers that had offered them to her, smooth, untouched by calluses. The vial popped, giving a loud sound as if from a much larger container, and when it punctured the silence, Marie noticed, as she brought the elixir to her lips, that the stranger had vanished. It went down like gin stewed with molasses, offensively alcoholic, a debilitating sweetness. Though he was nowhere to be found, a voice purred out from somewhere, perhaps not beside, behind, or around her, but rather from inside her. "This is where you long to be." After letting the vial slip from her fingers, Marie sat down. The sky swam pleasantly, and not long after, a pair of servants with lanterns and a hound approached her. They said she'd been sitting there for hours. that the auction had long since been over and that her husband was worried for her. In the records, it's noted that when Marie was told how long she'd been sitting, admiring the moon and the utter darkness, the first thing she said was, "I have a new husband now." The next 2 years were both the best and worst of Marie's life. From the outside looking in, she was a mess of manic symptoms. Euphoric, boisterous, and lively for 1 hour, and the next, solemn and weighed by depressive tendencies. A deep melancholy shadowed her. She was attended to by several physicians and priests ever since that night, almost all of which she attacked with immediate scorn and insults. She insisted that she need no medical attention. So much so that her family attempted on more than one occasion to make psychiatric and medical examinations seem to be impromptu and fun punctuations to social dinners, with happenstance doctors and priests as guests. It wasn't long before whispers of possession overtook the locals, her family, and the authorities looking in on the situation. Though this was chaos to everyone around her, for Marie she was as much at peace as she was the moment she opened the vial that the stranger had given to her. Though her moods varied, she felt no intense drive towards happiness or contentment, had no preference for it. Were she to be enraged, she felt this emotion as deeply and as happily as one might feel a sense of peace. Her journal entries, recovered after these incidents, reflect an infatuation with living, what to normal functioning members of society may seem like pure madness. This contentment persisted, and indeed was perhaps elevated, both during and after her becoming a widow. Her husband died on October 29th of 1619, leaving her alone with her 3 children, who at this time were at the mercy of the housekeepers, as Marie's psychological state was neither coherent nor temporary. She would reportedly sit for days on end by a window, her eyes dull and filmy as she watched, with little to no movement, a placid grin frozen on her expression. In her journal entries, she recalled visitations, illustrious conversations about philosophy, politics, even geography, with somebody she referred to frequently as her, quote, visitor. This dark visitor was the same man who introduced himself in the mansion gardens and offered Marie a tincture. Only, this man was no phantom or demon, not entirely, anyways. Unsurprisingly, he was a man of flesh and bones. In fact, our stranger was none other than Charles Poirot, a local doctor, one of the first who visited Marie after her night at the mansion. Charles continued on each visit to slip Marie the same tincture. Though nobody knew it, he was doing precious little to solve the mystery of what appeared to be a possession, and was, in fact, inducing all of the symptoms, if not inviting this dark entity to return again and again, though how he did this exactly is not precisely understood. Just what Charles was giving her cannot altogether be confirmed. In the records, it's been called a philter, a love potion. Professors such as Claude Pithoys expressed their suspicion that no substance could so readily induce years upon years of inexplicable behavior such as Marie's, especially not some of the more extreme physical symptoms. Amongst the dramatic shifts in her personality, Marie also suffered from convulsions. Again, Claude and other experts were dubious as to how this theory of the doctor's so-called poisoning was inducing such states for years on end. That is, after all, how long this lasted after her night at the mansion. Like other possessions of this time, controversies stuck to it like flies to a carcass. One of the primary journalists of this story was Monsieur Pochard, a doctor of medicine, and a physician to their Highness of Lorraine. Pichard's work was approved by doctors of theology and authorized by the Bishop of Toul in an assembly of scholars whom he sent for to examine the case and the reality of Marie's possession. Although ardently attacked by the likes of skeptics like Claude Pithoy, The events which played out told the whole story. After trying a host of remedies, countless physicians could not relieve Marie of her symptoms, what they referred to as extraordinary maladies. They were inevitably obliged to sanction the case as possession and resort to the only known cure, exorcism. So, on the 2nd of September 1619, they began. The exorcism commenced in the town of Remiremont. She was then transferred to Nancy. And once again, physicians declared that the casualties they had observed had no ordinary relation to known maladies. It could only be the result of diabolical possession. It was at this point that what was left of Marie's questionable state became utterly reduced to something else, something more. For many months she was inclined to manic episodes. She would describe pastoral visions, recount historical events beyond her education, even recite poetry which was centuries old. All the while she seemed perfectly happy, unaware of what appeared to be on the outside a horrific spiral into insanity, into the grips of something perhaps considered more sinister. That struggle was all over now. What lurked beneath the filmy consciousness took over entirely, that demon which crept behind the doctor's tinctures and inspired his actions, that so fluttered like a spark from one hand of influence into her heart. By the order of the Bishop of Toul, multiple individuals of influence were sent to aid in the exorcism. There was Monsieur Viardin, a doctor of divinity, a Jesuit, and Capuchin. Nearly all the monks in Nancy were sent as well, as was the Bishop of Tripoli, Monsieur du Sancy, the priest of Artois, Charles du Lorraine, Bishop of Verdun, and 2 doctors of the Sorbonne. When the possessions began, it was evident that any trace of Marie had long since fled her body. At the very least, it was no longer her personality masking something inhuman and demonic beneath. Rather, it was the inhuman and the demonic now masking Marie, drowned beneath diabolical layers. But were they diabolical? Reading these records, there is no evidence that the demon possessing Marie is attempting to hurt her specifically, and the recounts in her journal are not of nightmares and hellish visitations, but of worldly conversations with a powerful entity, one which seduced her not with lust or murder, but with knowledge, perhaps even just freedom of mind. When the demon was compelled from Marie, it spoke through her in multiple languages she had never learned before. He was given several commands in Hebrew, of which he replied pertinently. When addressed in French, the demon replied in French. However, he did so by saying, "Is it not enough that I show thee that I understand what thou sayest?" The same doctor, speaking to him, Monsieur Garnier, then addressed him in Greek, to which the demon replied in Greek, "Thou hast committed an error." When the doctor replied, "Point out my fault," the demon simply said, "Let it suffice thee that I point out an error. I shall tell thee no more concerning it." When the doctor, embarrassed by this, then resorted to demanding that the demon hold his tongue, he replied, "Thou commandest me to hold my tongue, and I will not do this." This introductory conversation continued like this, with the demoniac seemingly entertaining himself. Throughout, the doctors would command him to perform certain actions to prove his power, that he truly was an infernal entity possessing her body. The demon threw Marie upon the ground, made her prostrate herself to kiss the feet of the exorcists, and even caused her hair to stand out in the air, as if the locks were serpentine strands from Medusa. The physician, Monsieur Pichard, addressed the demon, partly in Hebrew and partly in Greek, while exorcising Marie. Hardly had he finished speaking the last words of the rite, when the demon replied, "Faith, we are not the cause of it. Her brain is naturally moist. That proceeds from her natural constitution." This seemed to suggest that Marie had a predilection towards being possessed, perhaps even felt called to the demon. Monsieur Pichard did not feel the gravity of these words. Instead, he turned and addressed the assembly. "Take notice, gentlemen, that he replies to Greek and Hebrew at the same time." "Yes," replied the demon. "You discover the pot of roses, and the secret I will answer you no more." Before the exorcisms were over, full discussions were had in no less than Italian, German, and of course Latin as well, the traditional language for exorcisms. at what point the demon even corrected one of the exorcist's grammar when speaking Latin. The assembly proposed to the demon very difficult questions concerning subjects such as incarnation, God, free will, the nature of angels and demons, specifically with their relationship to humans, and according to Augustine Clement, the primary research for which I have recalled these events, the demon replied with much clearness and precision. Marie discovered things unknown to each person in that room. She revealed to several of them some sins for which they had been guilty, dark events of remorse that only the individual had known. The demon was said to obey not only the exorcist, but anybody in that room, as if he was obliging them, entertaining them. The exhaustive measure taken to have a diverse cast in the assembly testifies to the veracity of these events. Multiple bishops, a host of monks, and even letters were exchanged to verify the authenticity of the possession. Marie herself could have no ulterior motive for choosing to act out in such a way, as she stands to gain nothing by being publicly investigated, exorcised, and apparently linguistically tortured. Not only does she stand to gain nothing, but it would invariably corrupt her reputation. The author, Clement, goes on to list French ambassadors, a duke in the court of Rome, and other individuals in high offices who risked their reputations as well to affirm this event. Perhaps most unsettling is that, as I approach the end of this particular chapter, my skeptic instincts kicked in. I recognized the strain in the author's voice, his yearning to have his beliefs be verified, his exhaustive measures, as if he was asking the reader, "You see, don't you?" But then he does this. He ends his story by saying that the nuns of Loudun were almost certainly a farce, a facade, that the reality of it could not be more doubted than at that time, and that the entire fiasco was problematic to this day as it hurt the reputation of true possessions and exorcists everywhere. If you haven't listened to it, the nuns of Loudun were featured in the 9th episode of Mania, just before this one. What's more is that Augustine Clement wrote an entire book on this subject matter, but this he was convinced was no hysteria. Our strange story of liberation through diabolical forces ends, like many others, with burning. In 1622, the doctor suspected of drugging Marie was captured, put to trial, tortured, and when he gave no confession, burned at the stake. This is one of the details that continues to simply confuse me, whether it's the nuns of Loudun or it's this story. Why were these men who were tried and tortured to such lengths, who knew they were going to die either way, so willing to hold on to their innocence or their guiltlessness, their refusal to make a false confession or even a true confession? Torture implements at that time were unimaginable to us today. It boggles me that these individuals endured it, knowing that they would die, regardless of what they said. In any case, in the end, Charles Poirot, the stranger at the edge of the forest, was seen as the magician which induced Marie's possession, was branded as the conduit between the demon and Marie's psyche. As his death rattles sang off into yet another crowd greedy to observe the sloughing flesh of a man, whatever entity which had seduced Marie began to wear off as well. Perhaps it left with the life of the doctor. Or perhaps, like the tincture left on the forest floor, it had come to be consumed, and consumed it was, and so now its deed was done and over, dranken in with curiosity, and sealed with sacrifice. By 1631, at the age of 24, Marie had endured the death of a husband, albeit a husband she was not thrilled about, and a 5-year-long exorcism. It was said that the stress of the events of her possession are partly what caused her husband to die. So she was able to leave that life of complexity and wealth behind. Just as she wanted, she founded an order and became a nun. The Order of Refuge, And so there she remained, peaceful, content, and ever better for whatever creature haunted her on that tedious, boring night. I suppose stories like this do have happy endings, after all. This tale had many twists and turns in it. Primarily, I was focused on breaking down the stigma of demons. In the first episode, I placated a host of common tropes. But in this one, I wanted to almost portray the demon as romantic, as, to be honest, there was room for it in the records and the history which described the events. The demon and the possession itself is never described as being malicious. Marie is never starved or hurt in any way physically. But the majority of the spun fiction is at the beginning of the story. In truth, we do not know where Marie met the doctor, Charles Poirot, or how their relationship came about. And I suppose by now you should know that every character in this story was a real individual, and all the authorities vouching for the veracity of it were also factual. We do know that allegedly Charles Poirot was courting Marie. There was some kind of romance, though it's unclear, and it was at the beginning of such advances that the symptoms of possession began. As for the other details, well, what can I say? There I was, composing this story and reading from a document written in the 18th century by a Benedictine monk, a monk who was present for these events, a monk surrounded by scholars, skeptics, doctors, the majority of which claiming that these very specific details are all concrete. The switching of languages, the unbelievable feats, the demon's inexplicable grasp of knowledge, and events lurking in the psyche of those around him, or at least Marie's, I suppose. I came to this section hoping to tell you what was real and what was fiction, but I have no answers. The historical records read like nightmares spun into fairy tales, whipped up with enough medical jargon and seals of authenticity to make anybody question what this mortal realm really is. Now, you know I have no religion. That's partially what I think makes me a fitting host for this podcast. However, I believe that no matter what you call them, what language they speak, how they walk or how they crawl, there are monsters in this world, and they exist in the shadows of our hearts, in the light of our dawns, in the euphoria of knowledge. And without them, what are we but fallen angels without a purpose? Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mania. God, that sounded lame. Okay, let's express how actually enthusiastic I am about this. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. This was the historic 10th episode. No longer are we in these single digits. These are the uncharted waters, people. How lovely. But before I say anything else, I really must express my sincerest gratitude for my Patreon subscribers. Their support of the show is helping give me the pragmatic means of getting more work done, having more time on my hands, and being more motivated to make this what it is. So I have to thank you deeply. And if you would like to if you would like to support the show, there is more than one way to do it. Firstly, you can rate and review it wherever you happen to listen to it. You can make a pact with your own demon and command them to spread the word, or if you are squeamish with sacrificial rituals, which I understand, they're messy, you can just tell your friends and families. Beyond that, you can visit my Patreon page, which is pretty cool, I must admit. As you may have noticed, there are no ads or sponsorships as of now, so this show is entirely listener-funded. But what Patreon does is allow you to give something while getting something back from me. I have a collection of essays which detail my philosophy behind this podcast and the rudimentary guidelines by which I construct each story. Now let's see, what else? Well, I thoroughly enjoy interacting with listeners on social media. Really, you people are such a crazy bunch and it's amazing. But I suppose it makes sense you're listening to me, so thank you for that. Your support has been profound there. And wow, you're still listening to me. Alright, well, there's good news. If you can't get enough, I have the perfect thing for you. On harlequingrim.com there is a very special project. It is called The Black Carnival, and it is an ever-evolving performance. Every story in The Black Carnival is kept brief, tantalizing, and enchanting. Like sideshows at a carnival, they're designed to capture your attention and let go. They're kept very brief. I'd advise anybody who enjoys Mania to tinker around with some of my very own dark fiction there. And with that, I think, sadly, it is time to let you go. But I do sincerely hope you will join me next time.